It's the Leading on Purpose podcast, helping leaders, teams, and organizations lead more intentionally, effectively, and with purpose. Welcome back to the podcast. Doug and I are back today, continuing our conversation about emotional intelligence. And so if you tuned in last time, we spent a fair amount of time just defining the concept in this giant bucket that is emotional intelligence. One of the things we wanted to do today for you is, if you're curious now, how do I develop myself on these areas of emotional intelligence? That's what Doug and I are here to cover with you. So Doug, thanks again for being here. Excited to continue talking emotional intelligence.
Same here, John. It's always good to see you.
So, where to begin as we think about people who are curious? Hey, I really want to develop myself. My ears went up, in some part of that last episode in terms of a particular skill that I want to work on. Maybe something I've been made aware of by those around me that I'm not doing as well as I could. Maybe overall, I'm just sitting here going, boy, the quality of my relationships in the workplace, not the level that I think they could be. Where do people start with this when they think in terms of developing emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's what an important question. And as you were phrasing that, I had this quote that I hadn't thought about in a long time, and it's just that it came in my mind. It's sitting there, so I'll throw it out there. But the quote goes something like this: "You have to begin the journey where you are, not where you wish you were."
Love that.
And so I think that's a great starting point. How do you begin this journey where you are in terms of your relationships, your behaviors, how others perceive you versus how you wish you were versus how you think you are? So to me, John, this step that we're going to focus on in today's conversation takes courage, because it's all about, who am I? How do people perceive me? And how can I have confidence in that information? So what I think might be helpful today for our listeners is just to talk about a variety of ways that you can gain the truth, if you will. What is that starting point? Where are you in your life's journey? What's working well that you want to build upon in terms of your emotional intelligence? And then what are those learning edges that might be available to you?
Yes. And I love you mentioned, that it's the pursuit of truth here, not where I think I am, where I actually am is where this journey begins. And it's yet another callback to something we mentioned before, which is part of emotional intelligence is getting curious around and getting passionate around closing potential gaps between intention and perception.
Yep.
So if perception is, I think I'm here, finding out the truth. Where am I actually at? How am I actually landing with the people around me, the relationships I'm in, workplace and otherwise, honestly.
Yeah.
And so in terms of developing myself and gaining the truth, I think there's an irony here. One of the first greatest steps you can take towards higher levels of emotional intelligence is having this level of curiosity that,
right.
Hey, there might be a gap. There might be something I need to do differently. Just for all you listening right now, that's a great first step towards better levels of emotional intelligence. Not just from an internal side, but in terms of the reaction of those around you. If they were to find out, I'm curious if there's better things I could be doing in the relationship, what a great first step towards developing it.
Yeah, it is. And so once you kind of step over that line, if you will, of, okay, I want to find this.
I'm going
out,
there.
Yeah. So, probably the most common tool, and you and I have used them in our coaching work over the years, and we've also been recipients of these tools, just our own curiosity, our own development over the years, are the variety of assessment tools that are out there, particularly 360 assessments. And so if any of our listeners maybe aren't real familiar with, why do you call it a 360? The beautiful part of these assessments, in my opinion, is you gain multiple perspectives of how people experience you. So it is that 360 all around you. And a starting point of a 360 assessment is my own perception, which is critical to this process. But then who else do I want to invite into the process to give me their truth of me? And so if you think about the workplace, there are a lot of folks that you'd want to get that opinion. Traditionally, you want your direct supervisor to be able to share with you his or her opinion of you. If you have team members that you're responsible for, your direct reports, who are the others in the organization that you routinely work on projects or have impact with? So those could be people at similar levels to you in the organization, peers. It could be folks more senior to you, less senior to you. But you start to think creatively around who are these folks that would have an opinion of me and what it's like to be in a relationship with me. And so as you approach the process of an assessment, if you decide to go that route, one of the key things is to really consider who I want to invite in, who's going to have a perspective of me that's important, something that I just simply can't have for myself. So yeah, the invitee list for the assessment process is one of the key elements of success.
Yeah, and I know you and I like to call out watch out fors. Here's a watch out for as you're crafting that list of people you want to participate.
Yep.
Are there people that should participate that maybe at first blush you don't want them to for one reason or another? The relationship is not in a great place. For whatever reason, you haven't done a great job of honoring feedback from this individual over the course of working with them. And so challenging yourself a little bit, holding yourself very accountable to, maybe there's a member of my team that I know I'm not resonating with, whether subconsciously or consciously. I've seen individuals want to maybe consider excluding that feedback, selling themselves on, that's not going to be as valuable. I found the opposite to be true, that in individuals whom we're not hitting the mark with in the relationship can provide some of the most powerful insights through an assessment tool, because it's very likely they're not going to offer that feedback to you otherwise because the relationship isn't in a great place. Right. And so through an assessment process, kind of unearth some things that are very likely in your blind spot that you may not be seeing. And so cast a wider net maybe than you think you want to include those people that you should.
Yeah, well, in a moment, we'll talk about some specific tools you may want to consider. And for now, we'll just talk more broadly and generally about the 360 process. But John, it's a really important point that you just brought up is cast that net wide. All the assessments I've used over the years, there's no limit on the number of people that you can invite into the process. On the other side, some assessment tools, in fact, most assessment tools have a required minimum number of people to have in a category for a variety of reasons. One, you'd want to protect the anonymity of the data coming back in. But just from a statistical standpoint, if you only get feedback, say, 2 peers in the organization, it's not to say there's not value in those 2 individuals' feedback, but the value of 10 peers giving you feedback so you can really see, are there consistent themes in the feedback? That's when the data becomes much more meaningful. So I always encourage people, the longer that invitee list, the better. And then to your point, the more diverse that list is in terms of just the quality of relationships. It's huge to put people on the list that maybe those are some relationships that aren't as strong as what you'd like. And, John, my guess is most of us at some point have been invited to participate in someone's 360 process. So once that list is determined, one of the things I also like to really encourage people to do is do a quality job of inviting people into the process and giving them a rationale as to why you're doing this. Most assessments, when you do this, once you populate with the names of your raters and their email addresses, boom, all of a sudden an email will show up for them saying, you're being invited to complete an EI assessment on Doug. Well, if you've not asked that person to participate or given them the heads up, one, in this day and age, they may look at that and go, oh, that's a problem email. I need to delete it.
Yep.
But if there's no context, if you haven't invited them and people are really busy, they may say, you know what, I no, I'm just not going to do it. So I am a huge advocate. Anytime you're going to have somebody participate in a 360 assessment, is to either personally invite them and give them the rationale for it, or at least send them an email, just saying, "Hey, I'm as part of my ongoing development. Here's what I'm doing. I value your opinion. I value our relationship, and I would really value and appreciate the feedback that you'd have to provide me." So I think sometimes doing a quality job of inviting and engaging your raters in the assessment process um, is missed by
Yeah.
quite a few folks.
Yeah. And another point of potential irony in a process of developing yourself in emotional intelligence, what a lack of emotional intelligence that would display if I would
Right.
allow an email survey link to be the first clue to you that I'm interested in developing myself.
Yes.
And so, again, one of those first steps towards higher levels of emotional intelligence could be this process of inviting people and getting out there and saying, I'm working on a few things and I'm getting curious around where I currently stand in terms of how I show up in the relationship with you. It would be really valuable to me if you could take the time to participate in this upcoming survey. It would really mean a lot to my development.
Yeah.
And I think that could be your next best step in that particular relationship towards seeing things go better for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. You mentioned even sometimes we have relationships that aren't as strong as we would like them to be. I myself have experienced it personally when I've invited those individuals into the process. And I've also coached folks that have invited colleagues into this process that maybe the relationship isn't that great. And I can't tell you how often just the invitation itself is a step in the right direction
Yeah.
in the relationship. It's this, hey, I respect you. I care about your opinion of me, and I want you to participate in this process if you're willing to do that. So there's very little downside
Yep.
to this, and often just the invitation itself and the way you do it can absolutely be a huge plus.
Yeah. You said, one other thing here, the way that you do it. It's one thing to say, I'm doing an assessment. It's another thing to
Yep.
to truly have it be an invitation. One of the things we mentioned in the prior episode is checking yourself on your motivations for improving your levels of emotional
Yep.
intelligence. And so again, that example of if your motivation is, well, I'm on a performance improvement plan, things have really gone sideways. My boss is forcing me into a process where I'm going to receive some coaching and an assessment. If that's what we're pointing towards as we go and invite people into this process, um, it's a clear sign to others that your motivation really isn't there to fix it. And so we
Right.
mentioned a lot of this emotional intelligence has to be preceded by your interest and your willingness to develop, to hear some things maybe you don't want to hear and to improve them. And so
Yep.
the more you can put that on display, even in your invitation to a feedback process,
Yep.
you're off and running.
Yeah, it's a great point, and John, maybe that's a good leap. We're gonna let's just pretend for a moment the assessment's now taken place. We've invited folks and they've completed the assessment. Now this is the thing that I have seen work not very well for folks, and it's so interesting to me that once they get the results, what do you do then? And we'll talk a little bit here in a moment around coaching support through the assessment process, and that can be really valuable to help you determine next steps. But I can't tell you the number of times I have facilitated a 360 assessment for leaders inside an organization. And somewhere down the road, I might have the opportunity to interact with some individuals that were invited into that process. And I'll just inquire, say, so after you gave the feedback on the 360, what happened next? Tell me about the experience. And I can't tell you how often it just kind of just people say, I never heard anything.
Mm.
And it's just like, really? And so, John, I know you and I are big advocates that after you get the results of the 360, I believe I'll use these words, go this far, say, I think you have an obligation to follow up with those folks, to at a minimum thank them for agreeing to participate in the process. By the way, you really don't know if they participated because no one's names are attached to it.
Yep.
But just say, I really appreciate your willingness to participate in this process. And I learned a lot about myself. And that wouldn't have been possible unless you and others would have agreed to participate in the process. And John, I'm also, I work with coaching clients around what are the major themes that you discovered from this process, and start sharing those with people. Here are the things that I learned about myself that are going well that I really need to continue to leverage and lean into. And then here are my learning edges that I discovered in this process, some things I'm going to be really focused on. And I'm going to be asking you and others to help me get better at that. And John, my experience with that is people are impressed by that. Again, it's a demonstration of emotional intelligence when
Yes.
you're willing to put that out there to folks, when you close that loop. And what it does, it creates an opportunity to have further conversations with folks.
Yes.
If I got 360 results and here are the three things I'm working on, let's say you were one of my raters, John, what a great conversation, opportunity for me to sit down with you and say, so John, those three things that I really stood out to me that I need to work on, I'd like to talk about those three things as it relates to you and I.
Yep.
When do you see me doing these things well? And then when are these an issue in our relationship? How can I start to work on these things in the context of you and I working together? And you talk about a deepening of relationships and progress. It's absolutely huge. But for whatever reason, it seems like a lot of folks, when they do 360 assessments, that follow up process just isn't part of their routine.
Yeah. And it's so important. I'd take it a step further and even say, shame on you if you don't go do that type of follow up, that you would open yourself up, get out there and ask people to spend the time, arguably, that it takes to give feedback in a process like this, and then not do anything with it. And worse, continue some of the behaviors that aren't serving you well because you didn't act on the feedback. And so it's such an important step. A couple of other reasons that I find it really important is there's this balance I think you have to strike in the follow-up conversation between, let me share with you some themes that I've become fully aware of, and sharing that in a way where this is fact. I heard the feedback, because it's very easy in a situation like this. And I've seen this even with leaders who go back and share the results of like a company-wide engagement survey, and you go have the follow-up conversation, and the people you're sitting in front of, let's say they're your group of direct reports, and they go, well, no, we didn't say that. That's not what we meant. And so you have to step into this with, no, these are the three themes that I know to be true. One, from the feedback. Two, from the fact that I processed it and I see myself in those themes. So let's just put those right out on the table.
Yep.
On the other side of that, though, there's an aspect of this that I need some confirmation from all of you that I've got this right in terms of the action steps I'm proposing to take. And so there's some curiosity you also have to bring to make sure you're not working on the wrong things. And so sometimes that can sound like, would it be helpful if I were to do more of this and less of that? Because that's my version of how this would impact this particular theme that I'm sharing with you. What's your reaction to that? Do you agree that would be helpful? And so it's, contracting for a little bit of agreement, confirming maybe your hypothesis on some of these themes, but most of all, ensuring I'm acting on the right things in the follow-up process. Because as with a lot of leadership development type things, the magic happens after those results come in. It's not the assessment process itself. It's what do you do with that information, and what changes, what shifts for you?
Well, I love the way you frame coming to the conversation with ideas and getting reaction to those ideas. I have found that is so much more productive rather than not coming to the table with ideas and simply turning to people and say, well, what do you think I ought to do? How could it be better? And depending on the relationship, particularly if you have direct reports and you're talking with your direct reports, that can be, especially if the relationship isn't that great, that can be a very difficult situation for your direct reports to be in. So I think the more that you can be forthcoming with ideas, it helps get the conversation started. And Because there could be some things that you suggest and your team is like, no, I don't know. No, but here's a variation of that or something different
Yep.
that we could try that could work for us. So the important thing is to have the conversation, to actually discuss it, and not just come up with the action items, but John, gain agreement on how are we going to continue this conversation, right? Is it once a week during our one-on-ones? Let's have a conversation around where have you seen me really improving in some of these areas, or where did I slip up? And even for me as a leader, I have found it's helpful for me to say, when I think on this past week, here are the 2 times that I think I did well on X that I'm working on. But man, the meeting that we had yesterday, I blew it again, didn't I? I didn't listen to people. I shot down ideas. And that's an example of what I'm needing to work on. Was that your experience in the meet? Did you feel shut down at times in the meeting? So if you've never had those kind of conversations in those ways with your people at first, it's not only going to be a bit different for you, it's going to be different for them too.
Yes.
Because, how many bosses ever talk to people on their teams with that kind of language? But I have no doubt if we did more of that, it's amazing how quickly we can see improvement in our relationships and ultimately the results that we're getting together.
Yep. Yeah, I find a lot of leaders find just a ton of value in the ability to use an assessment tool and a process to just put verbiage to what people have been experiencing, so we can name it. So then, to your point, when we're in that meeting next week, we're looking out for the same things, and we have the verbiage to use to talk about it. How did it go? Did we see X? Did we not see X? And so having kind of that common verbiage we can use to point to what's working and maybe not working as well, super powerful. The other piece I find for a lot of leaders when they do this follow-up process well is an extra layer of accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And you should not shy away from that when you think about the role that your direct reports can play in your leadership development. Some of the best development I've ever received in my career was by way of the feedback and accountability I received from people that were reporting to me.
Yes.
And so putting yourself out there in a very vulnerable way is one, it's a pathway to trust with your team, to enroll them in your growth that way. But what a powerful way to receive ongoing accountability to improve those things. And so we could talk about this all day, but just a ton of value in this follow-up process and a ton of risk when you don't engage in a follow-up process. So
absolutely,
stakes are raised when you open yourself up to an assessment process like this.
Well, John, maybe this would be a good time, if we've overviewed the general 360 assessment process itself, to talk a little bit specifically about ways that you and I have used tools, and even specific tools that we've used as it relates to emotional intelligence. And I'll jump in first. First of all, if you were to do the old Google search on EI assessments out there are a ton out there. There are some that you can do online for free.
Yep.
There's one I ran across lately just for grins. I was like, what's new out there in the marketplace around emotional intelligence assessment? And a lot of these are self-assessments, which I find interesting. Not to say there's no value to it, but what we're talking about with this 360 is there is a self-assessment component, but unless you can also bring other people's experiences with you into the picture, I'm not sure just doing a self-assessment around EI is going to be that valuable. For one thing, by definition, if somebody's not very emotionally intelligent, probably the data and the information they say about themselves is not going to be terribly valid. Just a few blind spots probably going on for the person. Now, if you're really strong in emotional intelligence, then it's probably going to paint a pretty accurate picture. So with that said, for me, the tool that I've used for years, and I know it's in your toolbox as well, it's through the Korn Ferry organization, formerly Hay Group, done in joint consultation with Dan Goleman, who we've talked about prior. He's written the book on emotional intelligence. It is a 360 assessment that I believe is about as good as it gets. out there in terms of getting feedback. You're able to execute this assessment exactly the way you and I have described it, different rater categories. I think I don't know what, John, are there maybe 6 or 7 rater categories that are available that you can use? Even with some of the folks that I've coached, there's a category called other. I've had folks even use the other category for people outside of work
Yes.
in their personal life. Not a lot of folks have done that, but they have. So there's an opportunity to collect information that makes for wonderful Thanksgiving dinner conversation. You can just pull out the old EI assessment results, and you can do that right after you talk politics that day at Thanksgiving.
And followed up with religion.
Yeah, there you go. Their assessment even has the opportunity to get client or customer feedback, which, depending on your role, that could be an external customers that you serve. It can even be internal customers that you serve as well. So one of the things I love, well, there's a lot I love about this assessment. One, it's steeped in research. The competencies that you get feedback on are continue evolving. The normative database that they use, comparing your results to others, is very strong. All the categories gives you an abundance of data that you can collect. So it is, again, the Korn Ferry Emotional Intelligence Assessment is certainly one of those tools at the top of my list.
Yeah, and I would agree. That's the primary tool that I use when our focus is on developing emotional intelligence, and I think it works well in one-to-one coaching situations. And I've also incorporated into cohort style group learning development, and it is steeped in research. The validity of the data, you get a strong sense as soon as you get your results that this is quality in terms of what you're looking at, and gives you some good snapshots across all the various competencies we talked about in our original emotional intelligence episode. Gives you a snapshot really across 3 fronts. One, how do I see myself on each particular competency that lives underneath emotional intelligence? How do others view me? And I can see that through the lens of just everyone else as one total group. I can also narrow it in by specific rater categories. So those categories you mentioned, that are my manager, my peer group, my clients and customers, direct reports, others. I can slice and dice and see how each of those groups, because it's when we're working on emotional intelligence, I've found in one or more of the competence areas, it's very likely that you're showing up differently for different groups, given the circumstances and the people involved, and so it helps you kind of zero in on where you might have particular opportunities with a competency. With what group should I focus on working on with this? So one view is your own. The other view is this, everyone else. The third view, and you mentioned this, is just your comparison to the vast Hay Group database, Korn Ferry Hay Group's database. Last I checked, I think it compares you against 80,000 leaders. And so you get kind of a comparison to this norm group that's been established through years and years of people completing the same survey process. And so just a powerful, powerful tool. One of the other features that I think is so valuable about this particular tool is the verbatim comments section. And so certainly you have a very familiar looking data report out, if you will, as you scan through the various competencies. It's bar graphs and scoring and all very familiar if you've ever looked at any sort of data assessment tool. But the back section of this will contain verbatim comments that people have provided, both to your strengths, things that they appreciate about what you're doing currently from an emotional intelligence perspective, and then areas of improvement that they'd like to see. And so to me, there's gold to be found in those verbatim comments in terms of the color it can add to what you're seeing across the competency ratings. And so I can't praise it enough, an extremely powerful tool and really my go-to when it comes to helping leaders. I want to talk about, in relation to this tool, Doug, any reasons why you might suggest it's not the right tool for people. One of the things I will mention before maybe we get the answer to that is I have a hard and fast rule when it comes to this particular tool and others like it. This is a developmental tool. And so this is not a tool that we would pull in and leverage necessarily for performance improvement planning to give a leader a score on a review.
Right.
This doesn't live on the performance side of things. This lives on the developmental side.
Yep.
And in fact, I've had a few situations where potential clients have wanted to use it for that other purpose, and I frankly won't support that. And so this is about your development and growth, and it's a tool that fits squarely in that bucket, in my perspective. But with that being said, Doug, any again watch out fors or any reasons why maybe this tool isn't the right one based on how you're trying to develop yourself on emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think you just called out one of the most critical reasons, and I'm aligned with you. I will not administer this assessment if I get a sense of it's really not being done for development. The other thing too, and it's somewhat related to this point, is understanding who's going to have access to the information and the confidentiality of it. The most common way that I administer a 360 is I make it clear that the person I'm coaching who's receiving the results, those are their results to do with as they see fit. Now, I certainly work with coaching clients to suggest that they communicate those themes that we talked about to their leader, to their teams. Most typically, though, I don't even encourage people to share the actual report itself because there's so much information in there. And I think it's more impactful if you just simply talk to the themes and put it in your language and in a way that you're comfortable with it. But I think the relationship that I have to get clarity on with that is someone's boss. And so I do that right up front. I tell them, yep, your organization's paying for this tool, but I will share it with the person that's being assessed and I will debrief it with them. We will work on the objectives. My hope is that they'll come to you saying, here's what I learned from the process. Here are the objectives that I'm working on. But, I'll tell you, I've had supervisors get in touch with me and say, hey, could you send me so and so's results? And my answer is no, that's not what we agreed to. You can certainly approach the individual and ask, could you see the results? And that's going to be their call, whether or not. So it's that's another element of this that I just think it's good to have clarity on the administration of it.
Yep. Yeah. And sometimes for me, because oftentimes when I administer this particular assessment tool, it's my recommendation that we combine some version of coaching with it. One, to help interpret, the results, give you this outside objective perspective on what these themes mean, what the results mean. But sometimes it's a coaching point to ask someone, who and how do you plan to go out and share this? Let's talk about the follow-up process. And if someone's in that place where, I'm not sharing this with my boss, it's not, hey, I'm going to send it to him anyways. No, to your point, we're not going to do that. But that's interesting now. Let's talk about that. What is it about that relationship that would leave you feeling like I can't or I won't share that with this individual? And so it becomes a point of coaching, because that is such an important relationship that, I've talked about in prior episodes, plays a heavy hand in how we're showing up, whatever's going on in that relationship with the boss. Okay. Anything else?
John, before we, because I know there's a few other tools that you use. While it's on my mind, I'll put this out there as well. One of the things about 360s is it can be a one-time deal, or you can do it again on down the road. And I've had a lot of individuals that will complete the assessment, get the results time one, and then we agree, when are we going to do this again? I would say the most typical time frame somebody's interested in doing that is probably around a year. A watch out for with 360 assessments is you don't want to do the reassessment and gather the feedback too soon. So research indicates something. I find this fascinating, and emotional intelligence is a great example of this, is that let's say that I get assessment results and I've got perfect clarity. Okay, here are the things I need to do differently. Here's what different looks like. Here's what better looks like. And magically, I'm able to start doing that tomorrow consistently, like a rock star. Well, what's interesting, people won't give you credit for that right away. And in fact, they might be a little bit, yeah, John just got 360 results. He's really on his best behavior these days, isn't he? Is this to be believed? And it's been shown it typically takes, with consistent change in behavior, or at least moving in the direction of a behavioral change, at least 6 months or so for people to start to shift their point of view and its believability. So anytime that reassessment is part of the equation, I always tell folks I work with, we wouldn't even consider doing this for at least another 6 months, and most typically it's closer to a year. So if you're interested in this process, know that if it makes sense in your situation, it can be a time one, time two. And that's powerful in showing you, is what I'm doing working? Is it making a difference? And John, this is where I get really pumped up as a coach, is when I'm working with someone that does successive assessments, and you just see the growth and the development in the shift of not only what others think of them, but John, it's also curious to see, what do they think of themselves? And you'll see confidence growing. You'll see a sharpened awareness of who they are. That gap between how they evaluate themselves and how others about them will oftentimes shrink, because they just have a truer picture of where they are. So again, not everyone is going to be interested in doing the assessment again, but if you are, there can be value to it. You just need to pay attention to the length of time that goes by.
Yep. Yeah. Point that you just made there that I want to zoom in on for a second is just the notion of beliefs. And so I think on the one hand, a really important piece of this is your belief in yourself when you go to develop yourself on these competencies. And so I found it helpful, depending on how people are viewing themselves and viewing let's say the results are not favorable. They get this assessment back and they look at it, and it's tough news as they walk through it, which is sometimes the case. That can get people a little down on themselves, a little down on their hopes, in terms of, well, there's too much water in the bridge. There's no way I can shift this. Right. And so I found it helpful sometimes to talk to examples and situations I've seen where that before after snapshot, you can turn it around and you can land in a different place, but it's going to take some work, and that work has to take place over time. But you have to go into this believing, I can shift things, I can change, I can react to this feedback. Yep. Now, the other side of beliefs that can hang leaders up is, well, why would it take 6 months or more for people to shift their beliefs? That's their problem. And I think one of the things you have to realize is, in the workplace and really in life, people's beliefs are generally shaped largely by their experiences. And so if they've got 2-3 years of a particular style of experiences in terms of how they work with you and what they've experienced, that shapes a set of beliefs, and which later feeds into their actions, what they do and don't do, until you shape a different experience, which takes time to undo and redo. That's when beliefs really start to change. And so it's not that they're not hearing what you're saying around the things you want to change, and you have the feedback meeting and they're bought in. That skepticism is not coming from a place of, I don't want to believe you, or you're not believable. It's, I need to see it. I need a different experience in our day-to-day, week-to-week interactions. And, that's what takes time generally.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
A couple other maybe final thoughts around this Korn Ferry Hay Group assessment. And this is really nitpicking. If there were any reasons that I were, to come to a place where I don't suggest this tool, for one, and again, this is really nitpicking, one thing that the tool does not do, because it does such a great job of painting that picture of how am I landing versus what I think I'm doing. What's that gap between intention and perception? What it doesn't go into as much, and maybe a couple of the other tools we mentioned do this, is telling you why you're showing up that way. What is it about your the way you're naturally hardwired your intentions, your motivators, your stressors, your personality, your priorities, preferences, all of that is feeding into how you're showing up in certain situations in the workplace. And so this particular tool, again, just getting really nitpicky, gives you that feedback around how I'm landing, but it doesn't necessarily go into that other side of things. Why am I showing up that way in stressful situations, or when it's time to give feedback or receive feedback? What's behind that? What's underneath the iceberg, so to speak? And so there are some other tools that can do that for you. And again, one other maybe nitpicky thing on this one is I found that this is a tool that you do need an interpreter.
Yep.
You do need some guidance and support from a consultant or coach for this tool to be fully leveraged. It is a difficult one to just run, so to speak, on yourself and act on the results. For one, you need that objectivity of an outside person, I think, for it to really translate well. But there's some translation of the theory that is really important. So you understand what am I being measured on and measured against in terms of these competencies? What's the science behind this? All of that's really, really important with this particular tool. And so again, if I was nitpicking, it'd be those two things. So anything else you would add?
Other than, John, you mentioned the coach that can help guide you through the process. I agree with you. The tool itself does not give kind of the why behind, and that's where a coach can be very, very helpful. And in some of our prior episodes, when we were doing a deep dive into the coaching leadership style and being a coach, one of the things we talked about is, being a coach is not being a therapist. So even a leadership development coach that you would engage in this process, they're not a therapist, and they can be helpful in helping you discover why the results are what they are. What's unique about this time in your life? What's unique about your work situation? What's unique about the relationship with your supervisor, your team? All those things. Again, great coaching is about asking questions to help you gain your own insight. And when you're getting a multiple page assessment result back, you need some help kind of reading between those lines, if you will, and really kind of pulling out those insights. So I agree with you. And in fact, the particular tool that we've discussed, it's not possible for you to complete the assessment without working with a certified consultant coach.
Yep.
Who can provide that tool for you.
Yep. Okay. So what other tools live in this 360 realm? Because there are a few tools that I know we want to take a look at that don't have the 360 view, but maybe go deeper on the why behind my behavior. Anything else you've seen in the 360 space that's helpful for people to, again, gain that clarity around how am I landing?
Yeah. And so again, if you Google just 360 leadership assessments, so you don't even put EI in it, now your world has expanded quite a bit. And John, over the years, as I think about either assessments that I've completed for myself to gain insight for myself, or working with clients, there are some other 360s that aren't EI specific, but they really have the elements of emotional intelligence. So just one example that I've had experience with in completing myself and administering is the Covey 7 Habits 360. Typically, you complete that as part of a seminar that you would attend.
Yeah.
The good news there is you can sign up for those around the United States. They're in abundance. Those can be brought into your organization. You might even have somebody certified in Covey if you're especially in a larger organization that conducts that. So even though emotional intelligence, I don't know if the language is even used in their 360s. I don't even know if the words emotional intelligence are in the book 7 Habits. But if you look at those results, the first few habits are all about self and managing self. The next set of habits are all about outward, your relationships with others. So the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a book about emotional intelligence without even using the words. So John, one of the things I suggest to folks is, some of those tools are a little bit easier to gain access to. It could be that over the course of your recent career, you've completed some 360s like that, that you could now, with a different filter, looking at it from an EI perspective, saying, oh, when I read that 360 results a year ago when it was done, I wasn't familiar with emotional intelligence. Now that I am, I'm seeing the feedback and results in a different light, something that could be helpful to you. So there's a lot of those types of 360s that are out there. I just call out the 7 Habits as one specifically that I've had experience with, and could be another valuable resource for somebody.
Yep.
How about you? What else are you familiar with that you might suggest?
I mean, like you said, there's just a ton of tools, and Google search would be pages and pages long. But one other approach that I've feel like I've found success with is going a more qualitative way, instead of using an actual assessment tool, is maybe developing a set of questions and then getting out there and having someone facilitate some Q&A with people around those questions.
Yep.
And so it's a 360 because we're going to ask, we're going to invite virtually the same audience we would if we were doing the Korn Ferry Hay Group tool, but they're going to go be basically interviewed on these questions. And so I know myself as a coach and consultant have facilitated that process. And so the way it generally looks is, one, certainly want to know from the leader why is it you want to engage in this process? What is it you're looking to work on? And then through that, develop some specific questions that we want to get out there and get the answers to from the team.
Yeah.
And then we, just like we do for the Korn Ferry Hay Group process, what is that group of people you want to invite in all directions, 360 degrees? And then I've gone out and conducted conversations with people in all directions to gather those results, that feedback. And so that can be another powerful way to gain insight here, and an approach that, if you thought the verbatim comments section in the back of the Korn Ferry Hay Group assessment was, powerful, you would really think this process was powerful, because your ability to probe, ask clarifying questions, when this is being facilitated, you can just go, much, much deeper on some of the themes that people are sharing to really understand them. So,
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I've done the same thing as well. That interview process can just, in some ways, be even more robust and rich than 360s, because you don't know what you're going to get into. So you start out with a standard set of questions. And I've even had it after I've interviewed, say 2, 3, 4 people, some things are starting to surface. I'll even check back in with my client that I'm working for and saying, hey, I'm noticing these things already. Here are some additional questions I would like to be sure to ask some other folks. So it's if you have somebody that's done that interviewing approach, and you're confident in their abilities, I think that's a terrific suggestion as well.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe setting aside the 360 where maybe we lose a little bit of, or a lot of, the intention versus perception, but maybe we gain potentially that deeper view. Why am I showing up that way? What's behind my behaviors?
Yeah.
There's a few tools in that arena that point towards your levels of emotional intelligence. And so one of those that I wanted to mention, and have had some great experiences with it over the last few years, is from Wiley and their DISC suite of tools. Yep. And one of the things, just, shameless plug here for Wiley, they're one of the assessment tools that I feel over the last decade has really done the best job of continuing to modernize their tools, moving light years beyond the old paper report and the Scantron used to get, a couple of decades ago, and really made their tools user-friendly and interactive. And with that, they've bolstered their research and re-benchmark their tools. And so one of those tools they have actually in the DISC suite of tools is called Agile EQ. And it is directed at helping people understand their level of emotional intelligence. Obviously, what's lacking there is you don't get the 360 view, because there's not a feedback component of the assessment process. It's all self-assessed. but it's done through the lens of DISC, which I think can be pretty powerful for people, because if you're wondering what's going on underneath the iceberg, why do I do that? Why is it when there's a bit of stress and tension, I show up this way? And it can give you some clues and evidence as to why you're doing that. And I found the DISC theory, which has been around, frankly, since the late 1920s. It resonates with people. It makes sense. And so if you know anything about DISC, you got the 4 quadrants: dominance, influence, steadiness, conscientiousness. And really what it's given you a snapshot of is your level of acceptance versus your level of activity. How fast-paced are you versus more moderate-paced? Well, based on where you kind of plot on those two continua, the Agile EQ module gives you a sense of how you're likely to show up in various situations, what your motivators will be. Because again, DISC is one of those tools that is very much about understanding your priorities and preferences and how those priorities and preferences play off of those around you. And so what I love that they've done with this tool is it really helps you understand, depending on whether you're more D, I, S, or C inclined, where are my comfort zones? Where are my stretch zones? So what are those situations where if I don't pay close attention and I don't engage in acts of self-management, might I default to a behavior that likely doesn't serve me well? Yep. And then how does my DISC plot through this Agile EQ kind of put me in situations where I'm at odds with someone who doesn't think the same way that I do, doesn't have the same priorities and preferences? And so it's just a powerful way to get a little bit more underneath the hood in terms of, why do I show up a certain way? And I love the title of it, Agile EQ.
Yep.
And, the term leadership agility is another one of those terms that's kind of been thrown around the last 5 years or so. For me, leadership agility is really has 2 pieces. One, do I know which tool to choose in terms of behaviors for a given situation? And the second, do I know how to leverage that tool?
Yep.
And, in earlier episodes, I've talked about, the various leadership styles that are out there. And the analogy I've always loved is golf clubs in a golf bag. And same goes for some of these EQ behaviors you might exhibit. It's knowing which one of those clubs is right for the situation I'm in, depending upon the shot I'm faced with taking. And then do I know how to use that tool?
Right.
And so it just gives you a real strong sense of how you're likely to show up in situations based on, the original tenets of the DISC theory. So great tool that I would strongly recommend. In terms of ease of use, you need a bit of interpretation, maybe not as much as Korn Ferry Hey Group,
Right.
but you do need, someone with that objectivity, someone to, help you interpret the results of your assessment and how they look through this Agile EQ lens. Most importantly, I think you need some support in determining, well, what does this tell me around what actions I should take? How to lean more into maybe my stretch zones, areas that aren't as comfortable for me. And so, very much an action-based tool as much as it is looking underneath the hood.
Well, it is, and I've always been a big fan of DISC for all the reasons you just suggested. I've not used the agility tool that you just described, but I'm intrigued by that, and I can see the value of it. John, early on in our conversation today, when we talked about inviting raters into a 360 process, is embrace folks that maybe the relationship isn't as good as you would like it, and often my experience is when you peel back those relationships, what's foundational to some of the tension inside that relationship is a difference in personality. And so DISC can not only be the benefit of you understanding yourself better, but it can also give you great insight into who other people are and the relationship that you are. So here is who I am, and now I'm interacting with this person who may or may not be different than me, because even two like-minded
Doesn't always work.
It can be work as well. Being in healthy relationship is work. I mean, it just is. A great marriage takes work. And I don't mean work in the, oh, I dread this kind of thing, but just work because I love you so much. I want to work on this relationship. So this can not only be great um, insight to yourself, but also others as you're working on your emotional intelligence and improving relationships can be a great way to gain insight about how do I flex um, to this individual that agility that I need to display to further improve that relationship. So, yeah, another great suggestion, and specifically the tool you mentioned, could be a wonderful add to your development library for sure.
Yeah, and as a last piece on DISC that I think is really valuable is the opportunity to not only understand that other people's personalities, their priorities and preferences um, might be different than mine, might be the same as mine to a conflict point.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can obtain someone else's DISC plot and really get some insights into, and you don't have to have them go through the Agile EQ model. Just knowing where they
Right.
plot on the basic DISC tool can give you good insights into where is there likely to be some tension and friction in this
Yep.
relationship when we're faced with a short deadline, when we're
Yep.
faced with challenging goals, when we're forced to exchange tough feedback. What does my Agile EQ show me or tell me about how I might show up in this relationship with this particular person and their plot? And so, DISC, I think, from a team view perspective, can get really, really interesting.
Absolutely.
So,
Yep.
uh, another tool that kind of lives in this realm of getting underneath the iceberg, understanding what's motivating me. And in terms of the need for an interpreter, this one's probably the most user friendly, meaning you don't really need an interpreter as much, is StrengthsFinder. And I found StrengthsFinder to be provide some interesting clues into, kind of left to my own devices, how am I likely to
Mhm.
show up in a situation? And what things might I need to self regulate, self manage? I always call it with strengths, kind of throttling back on maybe one or more of my top 5 strengths versus throttling up on some others that I'm not using as much
Yep.
to produce a more favorable result in my interactions. As it relates to coaching, I found StrengthsFinder to be really helpful to help us understand what our priorities will be as we're coaching someone. And if our intention through coaching is to display high levels of emotional intelligence, have this interaction, resonate with the other person, knowing, what your mind will do unchecked can be really
Right.
powerful. And so, just as a quick example with StrengthsFinder, for those individuals who have a lot of dominance in the execution realm. So, if you have strengths like restorative, responsibility, achiever, competition, your goal there is get her done. And so, what'll happen over the course of coaching someone that could become a display of a lack of emotional intelligence is you're trying to move this thing through to a conclusion, and you might not fully hear the person out. And so, the listening and empathy can sometimes end up going right out the window because the goal is resolution. Let's get this
Yep.
thing solved. Well, there's an opposite problem that's faced, for example, for people who prioritize relationship building. So people who have empathy as one of their StrengthsFinder strengths, or some of the other relationship building related strengths, you might get lost in the story. And so if someone is engaged in a coaching conversation with you, we're not actually helping them move it through to any sort of constructive conclusion. We're just kind of in this loop of just hearing the story over and over and over again. And while the listening and empathy is on high display, the person may walk away after the
Yep.
second or third time talking to you. That wasn't as helpful. It didn't get anywhere. And so knowing how your strengths show up for you in the various situations you face, some serve you really well in terms of displaying emotional intelligence. Some can get in your way. But again, what I'll say about StrengthsFinder, super user friendly. You don't need me or Doug to
Yep.
be able to process the results and put some things into action. Any other tools we haven't mentioned that we've had personal experience with?
Well, the last one that I'll bring up, and it's the least sexy of all of them, is relationships that you have. And what I mean by that is you may not do a 360. And by the way, I still think 360s are great, or some of the personality assessments that we've discussed. But if nothing else, is to utilize those individuals in your life who are invested in you and in the relationship. And those could be at work, those could be in your personal life, but who is it that knows you well? Who are there relationships in your life where you can be vulnerable and real? And you may not be operating at the level of sophistication of emotional intelligence and Corn Fairy and the data, but just real world conversations around where can I be better? And I'll just share a real quick story for me. Just over this last week, I have a sister who lives in Denver, and she and I were together with my parents in Columbia, Missouri. I live in Kansas City. Columbia's a few hours from here. And I'm so blessed to still have my mom and dad in my life. And we are at the stage of life where it's becoming increasingly a challenge for them to live independently in their home. So we're in that process of getting ready to move in the not too distant future. And so this last week was all about cleaning out 30 plus years of stuff in a house. And any of us that have lived in a place for a while can relate to how things accumulate. And so it's hard work to do that, but it's also emotional work. And I communicated with my sister some of the things that I noticed about myself this last week. I know there's some gifts that I bring to the table that really helped the process this week. But on my drive back home to Kansas City, I was thinking about, wow, what are some things I want to do better and different in this very unique time in life with my parents? And I shared those with my sister. And I shared it with her, not just to share it, but to also drive accountability. And I specifically am saying, if you see me getting away from these desires of managing some of these things in myself, tell me about it. Call me on it. And my sister and I have a great relationship, and I trust her. We trust each other. And I'll do the same thing for her. So, John, I just offer that up. Any moment in life, we can be working on ourselves, and a very simple thing to do. And it's what a great gift to have in life are those relationships where you can be that real, that raw, that vulnerable, and just say, I'm working on myself, and here's some things I'm working on right now, real time. And you happen to be in a position you're going to see when I do it well and not do it well. Will you help me get better at this? And so, doesn't cost a nickel. Right?
Yeah.
It doesn't require an assessment to be done, but it's just one, being aware of where you are in life, what you're working on. Then two, who cares about you and who's going to be willing to invest that time with you and provide you that feedback. So I can't tell you the number of people over the course of my life that have served that role for me. And sometimes those conversations have been hard. A few of those conversations, people have started out with me, Doug, this is going to be hard for you to hear, and it's a challenge for me to tell you this, but I owe it to you. And John, there's never been a time where I'm not deeply thankful for that kind of relationship and that courage that somebody would talk with me. So I just offer that up. If somebody's just looking for a starting point, and they're not quite ready for these assessments, maybe it's a person or two in your life that you can lean on. So I offer that up as well.
Great story. Yeah. And I think another question that maybe your story answers that some of our listeners may be having is, well, what does it look like when I'm doing it, when I'm being emotionally intelligent? And so is it executing all the competencies that we described in the prior episode? Yeah, I'm listening, I'm being empathetic, I'm regulating. But at the end of all of that, what does it actually look like to be emotionally intelligent? And so one definition I have that your story kind of shows in spades, it's being who others need you to be in the relationship at that given time. And you mentioned the word role. And I know you and I have done a ton of work over the years helping people think about the role that they play personally, professionally, boss, friend, mother, father, paying attention to what are the needs of the other person in this relationship and the role I'm playing right now today. To me, that's the ultimate kind of personification of being emotionally intelligent.
Yeah.
And at a large scale, it sounds like that's what you're doing for your family. Small example, and this is a story I always loved. I had a boss years ago who had a rough morning, came in and just wanted to quickly define emotional intelligence to the rest of us. And basically, she had borrowed her husband's car, and so he was in the driveway, and she backed out of the garage, tore the side view mirror off as she backed out on his brand new car. She rolled down the window. By the time the window was all the way down, she was sobbing. And he said, "I love you. Have a great day at work." And to her, that was a personification of emotional intelligence.
Yeah,
for him to know she doesn't need me to yell. She doesn't need me to beat. She's doing it to herself already.
Yeah,
she needs to go have a great day.
Yeah,
and so when we think about what emotional intelligence looks like in practice, it's just paying attention to what do others need from me in this relationship, work or otherwise.
Yeah, great story.
Yeah,
great story.
Well, what a great conversation today. And I'm hopeful that our listeners have really gathered some powerful insights into different ways to develop themselves. Certainly if you're interested in one of the tools that we talked about specifically today, StrengthsFinder, DISC, Korn Ferry Hay Group, Emotional Intelligence, those are tools that you do need the support of a consultant and coach on. So bit of a shameless plug, but those are all tools that I leverage quite frequently. And so if that's of interest to you to learn more, certainly reach out. But it's likely you have resources right there within your organization. Most organizations have individuals in their learning development HR departments that either have access to these tools themselves or can reach out and get access. And nearly any coach or consulting firm that's out there that you come in contact with is going to have tools that can support you in this realm of emotional intelligence, because it's such an important topic. As we talked about in our last episode, it is the differentiator. And so there's plenty of resources available out there. Our hope is that you take action on this, do something with this, and decide where you're at in the journey, begin that journey where you're at, and figure out what steps you need to take. So thanks so much for tuning in yet again to today's episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.